In the opening days of January 2022, the world's 9th largest country by landmass, Kazakhstan, was suddenly on fire. What began as a protest over a fuel price hike in a remote oil town exploded into the largest civil unrest the nation had seen since its independence in 1991. Cities fell into chaos. Government buildings were stormed. Security forces opened fire on civilians. The government's response was swift and brutal.
In Almaty, running battles lasted on into the night.
President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev issued a chilling order to his security forces: shoot to kill without warning. Official figures acknowledged at least 238 dead. Thousands were arrested. Countless more simply disappeared into detention centers where torture allegations quickly surfaced. But behind the chaotic images that flashed briefly across international news, a darker reality was buried. The regime didn't just crack down on protesters. It manipulated the narrative, labeling citizens as terrorists.
In an address to the nation, he threatened tough action and declared a state of emergency. He's called on neighbors, including Russia, for help.
It suppressed independent media, cut off the internet, and silenced witnesses. It erased much of what really happened. This was not just civil unrest. It was a massacre, followed by an information blackout, an authoritarian state's attempt to erase a national trauma before the world could fully understand it. Few outside Kazakhstan realized the full scale of what happened. Today, we dig into the hidden story of Kazakhstan's Bloody January, how a peaceful protest movement became a national tragedy, how an authoritarian regime clung to power, and why the lessons from Kazakhstan matter far beyond Central Asia.
Officers and National Guardsmen have been killed. Chaos is spreading. Paul Adams, BBC News.
To understand how Kazakhstan reached the breaking point in January 2022, you have to understand the power structure that defined the country for decades. Following its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, Kazakhstan was led by Nursultan Nazarbayev, a former Communist Party official who became the nation's first, and for many years, only president. Under Nazarbayev, Kazakhstan projected the image of a modern, stable, economically booming state. The country leveraged its vast oil, gas, and mineral wealth to attract international investors and political partnerships. Major cities like Astana, now Nur-Sultan, and Almaty underwent massive development, showcasing glittering skyscrapers and ambitious infrastructure projects. But beneath the surface, Kazakhstan was an authoritarian state. Political opposition was tightly suppressed. Independent media faced constant harassment and closure. Elections were largely ceremonial, with predictable outcomes. Nazarbayev ruled for nearly 3 decades, cultivating a powerful inner circle of loyal elites who dominated politics, business, and law enforcement. Even when Nazarbayev formally stepped down in 2019, handing the presidency to his chosen successor, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, real power remained concentrated. Nazarbayev retained his titles: leader of the nation, a symbolic position granting him immunity and influence; chairman of the Security Council, placing him in direct control of Kazakhstan's security forces. For ordinary Kazakhs, little changed. Wealth was concentrated among a small elite. Corruption remained endemic. Living standards for most people stagnated, especially in rural and industrial regions like western Kazakhstan. Frustration simmered quietly for years. Meanwhile, government propaganda emphasized stability, often warning citizens that political dissent would lead to the kind of chaos seen in neighboring countries. By late 2021, tensions were quietly growing. When the government lifted price caps on liquefied petroleum gas, the fuel most Kazakhs depended on for transportation, the fragile balance snapped. The fuel hike was the spark, but the fire had been building for a very long time. The immediate cause of Kazakhstan's 2022 unrest seemed, at first glance, almost simple: a sudden spike in fuel prices. On January 1st, 2022, the government lifted long-standing price caps on liquefied petroleum gas, a crucial resource in Kazakhstan. In many parts of the country, especially in the western oil-rich regions, LPG wasn't just a commodity, it was the primary fuel for vehicles in daily life. With the removal of price controls, the cost of LPG doubled overnight. For many Kazakhs already struggling under stagnant wages, rising cost of living, and widening inequality, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a breaking point. In western Kazakhstan, where the first protests erupted, LPG-powered vehicles were the norm, not the exception. The hike disproportionately impacted working-class citizens, particularly industrial workers, truck drivers, and small business owners. Anger quickly spread from isolated towns to larger cities, fueled by years of economic frustration and political disenfranchisement. The first major protest broke out in Zhanozin, an oil town already known for its history of labor unrest, including a violent crackdown on striking oil workers back in 2011. But this time, the unrest didn't stay local. Within days, protests spread to Aktau, another western city, then to Almaty, Kazakhstan's largest and most populous city, then across all major urban centers. Importantly, the demands evolved rapidly. Protesters initially called for a reduction in LPG prices, but very quickly, slogans and banners expanded to broader political demands. Resignations of corrupt officials, an end to Nazarbayev's lingering influence, more democratic freedoms. The protests were notable for being leaderless and decentralized, making them difficult for the government to negotiate with or control. Social media, despite heavy censorship, allowed demonstrators to share videos, images, and real-time updates, helping the movement gain national momentum. Kazakhstan's government found itself facing something it had not experienced in decades: a truly widespread grassroots rebellion, cutting across regional, ethnic, and class lines. The authorities quickly realized that this was not just about gas prices anymore. The people were channeling the entire system, and the government was about to respond with force. As protests spread across Kazakhstan in the early January 2022, the government moved quickly and aggressively to regain control. At first, authorities attempted limited concessions. Fuel prices were partially rolled back to previous levels in some regions. The entire national cabinet resigned at President Tokayev's request. Nursultan Nazarbayev was removed from his powerful post as head of the Security Council, a symbolic move meant to placate demands for political change. But these measures failed to calm the unrest. The protest had already evolved beyond economic grievances. They now embodied years of accumulated anger over inequality, corruption, authoritarianism, and repression. In response, the government escalated its tactics dramatically. By January 5th, the situation had spiraled into open confrontation. In Almaty, protesters seized government buildings, including the mayor's office and airport. Parts of the city descended into chaotic clashes, with buildings set ablaze and sporadic looting. In other regions, mass demonstrations continued, mostly peaceful, but facing increasing police aggression. President Tokayev declared a state of emergency across the country. Curfews were imposed. Public gatherings were banned. Movement restrictions were enforced. When these measures proved insufficient, Tokayev took an unprecedented step. He formally requested military assistance from the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a Russia-led regional alliance. Within 24 hours, over 2,000 foreign troops, primarily Russian paratroopers, arrived in Kazakhstan, ostensibly to protect key government facilities. But the most chilling moment came on January 7th, when Tokayev issued a televised address. "I have given the order to law enforcement agencies and the army to shoot to kill, without warning. There would be no negotiations. Security forces, including army units and riot police, opened fire with live ammunition on demonstrators across multiple cities. Eyewitness accounts and video footage captured horrifying scenes. Protesters shot while running unarmed through city squares. Snipers reportedly firing from rooftops. Armored vehicles patrolling streets littered with debris and bodies. The government labeled the protesters bandits and terrorists, alleging without clear evidence that foreign-trained extremists were behind the unrest. This narrative served two purposes: justify the use of deadly force and discredit the legitimacy of grassroots grievances. Meanwhile, thousands were arrested. Many detainees reported beatings, torture, and other abuses while in custody. By mid-January, official figures confirmed over 9,900 people detained, 238 confirmed deaths, including children, at least 6 deaths occurring in detention centers. But independent observers, barred from fully accessing detention sites or hospitals, suggested the real toll could be much higher. Kazakhstan's brief window for reform had slammed shut, replaced with violence, censorship, and fear. When the streets of Kazakhstan finally fell silent in mid-January 2022, it was not because grievances had been addressed. It was because the government had enforced silence through fear, arrests, and an information blackout. During the height of the crackdown, nationwide internet shutdowns were implemented, cutting off mobile data, social media, and independent news websites. Messaging apps like WhatsApp and Telegram were intermittently blocked to prevent protesters from organizing or sharing evidence of abuses. Journalists were harassed, detained, or threatened, both local reporters and foreign correspondents. In many cities, residents had no reliable way to communicate with the outside world for days at a time. When the internet was partially restored, government narratives flooded the media. Protesters were repeatedly labeled as terrorists and foreign agents. Official channels framed the crackdown as a necessary defense of national stability. Reports of civilian deaths, abuses, or arbitrary detentions were downplayed or denied. This tight information control allowed the authorities to rewrite the story before it could fully reach the international stage. In the chaos that followed, thousands of detainees were held in overcrowded facilities without formal charges. Numerous reports emerged of torture, beatings, and inhumane conditions. Families searching for missing relatives were often turned away or given contradictory information. According to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, multiple deaths in custody were reported under suspicious circumstances. Some survivors later described electric shocks, broken limbs, forced confessions under duress. In most cases, no independent investigations were allowed, and few officials faced any serious consequences for abuses. To manage growing international pressure, President Tokayev announced a series of reforms later in 2022. Promises of constitutional amendments, proposed economic restructuring, a public commitment to strengthen human rights protections. But critics argue these reforms were cosmetic at best. Key political positions remained in the hands of loyal elites. Security forces accused of abuses were rarely prosecuted. Independent oversight mechanisms were either non-existent or tightly controlled by the state. In short, the system that enabled Bloody January remained intact, simply rebranded. For many Kazakhs, especially those who lived through the crackdowns firsthand, the trauma remains fresh. Public gatherings are still met with heavy police presence. Activists and opposition figures continue to face harassment and surveillance. Trust in government institutions, never strong to begin with, has been further eroded. The message was clear: challenge the system and you risk your life. Kazakhstan may have returned to outward calm, but the memory of January 2022 cast a long shadow over its future. As images of burning government buildings and reports of mass casualties filtered out of Kazakhstan in January 2022, the world watched with shock, but responded with caution. The international community's reaction was a complex mix of concern, muted condemnation, and strategic hesitation. Several major governments and international organizations expressed official concern over the violence. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights urged Kazakhstan to respect protesters' rights and called for independent investigations into the use of force. The European Union called the loss of life deeply troubling and demanded accountability. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other NGOs issued detailed reports highlighting alleged abuses, including unlawful killings and torture. However, beyond expressions of concern, concrete actions were rare. Kazakhstan occupies a strategically sensitive position. It is rich in oil, gas, and uranium, making it a critical supplier for global energy markets. It sits at the crossroads between Russia, China, and Europe, giving it significant geopolitical leverage. It has long been seen as a stable ally by Western governments eager to balance Russian and Chinese influence in Central Asia. For these reasons, many countries, particularly European powers and the United States, were careful not to alienate Kazakhstan's leadership too forcefully. Meanwhile, Russia's role in the crisis was both immediate and influential. The CSTO intervention, dominated by Russian troops, helped Kazakhstan's government regain control during the worst days of unrest. Russian media echoed Kazakh state narratives, portraying protesters as foreign-backed extremists seeking to destabilize the region. Russia's support underscored the reality that Moscow had no interest in encouraging popular uprisings near its borders, especially at a time when it's preparing its own escalations in Ukraine. This alignment gave Kazakhstan further cover to deflect international pressure. Despite early calls for an independent inquiry, Kazakhstan's government announced internal investigations that largely exonerated security forces, blamed the violence on foreign terrorists without providing credible evidence, and released minimal information about the identities of those killed, detained, or tortured. As months passed, international focus shifted elsewhere, to crises like the war in Ukraine, economic inflation, and other global emergencies. The victims of Bloody January were gradually forgotten by the global headlines. For many inside Kazakhstan, the message was bitterly clear. Justice would not come from outside. Accountability would not be enforced by international powers. The regime had survived, the cost had been counted, and the world, largely, had moved on. The events of January 2022 in Kazakhstan offer far more than just a snapshot of unrest. They reveal deep, uncomfortable truths about modern authoritarianism, the fragility of public trust, and the limits of international accountability. The uprising began with fuel price protests, but it quickly morphed into a full-scale political revolt. This underlines a critical lesson. In authoritarian states, economic pain can ignite political transformation. Not because citizens are suddenly politicized, but because grievances are cumulative. Years of inequality, corruption, and repression create a tinderbox. All it takes is one spark. Kazakhstan's government underestimated the anger simmering beneath its facade of stability. When the lid finally blew off, it was not over abstract ideals, but the tangible cost of daily life. Despite the intensity of the protest, Kazakhstan's ruling elite survived by doing what authoritarian systems do best: rapid, overwhelming suppression combined with controlled concessions. Force was used unapologetically. Narratives were swiftly shaped to delegitimize opposition. Superficial political reforms were dangled to diffuse international criticism. The Kazakh regime demonstrated that in authoritarian environments, survival often depends on controlling not just violence, but also the narrative around it. It wasn't necessary to convince everyone. It was enough to create confusion, fear, and exhaustion. Kazakhstan's handling of the crisis also exposed the fragility of global pressure on authoritarian regimes. Strategic importance often outweighs human rights concerns. Western governments, needing Kazakhstan's oil, minerals, and geopolitical stability, tempered their criticism. Russia's rapid involvement through the CSTO reinforced the notion that regional authoritarian solidarity can blunt external influence. In a world of shifting alliances and competing crises, even large-scale state violence can fade from global memory if the political costs of confrontation are too high. Finally, Bloody January reminds us that behind every statistic is a human story. Families who never received justice for lost relatives. survivors living with physical and psychological scars, entire communities left to rebuild trust under the shadow of fear. Mass repression isn't just a political tactic, it's a societal wound that can last for generations. In the vast steppe of Central Asia, Kazakhstan often projected an image of stability, progress, and quiet economic success. But the events of January 2022 revealed a different reality, one where anger over injustice, inequality, and repression boiled to the surface, and where the government chose violence over dialogue. Bloody January wasn't just a sudden explosion of unrest. It was the outcome of years of silenced dissent, unaddressed grievances, and concentrated power. The government's brutal response and the calculated effort to erase the truth shows how quickly even peaceful protests can be rebranded as terrorism in the service of state survival. It also reminds us that freedom is fragile where information is controlled. Accountability cannot exist without transparency, and silence is not peace. It is often the echo of fear. Today, Kazakhstan's leadership claims the country has returned to stability. Official memorials are few. Independent investigations are absent. Public discussion remains cautious. But for those who lived through it, the trauma of Bloody January remains vivid. And for the world, it stands as a powerful, if uncomfortable, reminder: authoritarian regimes rarely fall overnight. They bend, they adapt, and if necessary, they suppress. Kazakhstan's secret riots are not just a chapter of regional history, they're a warning of how easily public voices can be silenced, and how important it is to keep telling their stories even when the headlines move on. Because remembering isn't just an act of history, it's an act of resistance. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.